The galactic conclave had seen empires rise and fall like tides. It had witnessed the Drathari burn 3-star systems in a single century, watched the Yulani merchant collective quietly buy sovereignty over 6 planetary governments without firing a shot, and it had cataloged the extinction of the Mevari, a gentle, brilliant species, who made the fatal mistake of having a homeworld rich in neutronium and a military too small to defend it. The conclave had seen everything, or so it believed. In the Grand Assembly Hall of Station Voss, a structure so large it had its own weather systems in the lower decks, Assessor Vral of the Keth Directorate stood before a wall of light that displayed humanity's registered fleet. 112 vessels, modest frigates, science platforms, a handful of patrol cruisers that other species would classify as adequately armed. For a civilization 80 years into the conclave, humans had built exactly what was expected of them. Exactly what the Voss Accord permitted. Vral had been doing this job for 30 years. He had a nose, metaphorically, since Keth had no external nasal structure, for when numbers told stories they weren't meant to tell, and humanity's numbers had been whispering to him for months. The refined titanium output from Mars alone was enough to build 40 registered warships per year. Humanity was officially building 6. The neutronium alloy purchases from the Belvari deep mines had tripled in a decade. Humanity cited infrastructure expansion. The dark matter fuel cell imports, the kind used exclusively in large-scale propulsion systems, had increased by a factor of 11 in 15 years. 11. He had flagged it, filed the report, watched it get buried under more urgent matters: the Drathari border disputes, the Yulani trade negotiations, the Sorvak religious crisis. Humanity was patient, peaceful, cooperative. They attended every summit, paid every tariff, smiled in every corridor of Station Voss and asked about your family and somehow always remembered your name. They were harmless. The Conclave's senior council had said so, repeatedly, in the comfortable way powerful people say things they have never actually verified. So Vral was dispatched to Earth, a routine inspection, something to close the paperwork loop and let the council return to worrying about the Drathari, who were currently positioning 3 battle groups near the Kepler belt and calling it a navigational exercise. He arrived at Earth on a gray Tuesday morning. Humans were inexplicably attached to numbing their days, and was received with extraordinary hospitality. Director General Amara Osai herself met him at the Cape Town orbital elevator, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and the particular kind of stillness that Vral had learned over decades to associate with people who were never surprised by anything. She gave him full access, every shipyard, every registered facility, every dry dock and construction bay in the Sol system. Vral spent 3 weeks touring them, cross-referencing manifests, interviewing engineers, scanning for residual energy signatures. He found nothing. Clean facilities, cooperative staff, registered ships in registered berths. Mars was, as claimed, expanding its underground cities. The fuel cells were, on paper, powering a new generation of civilian deep-range transports. On his last night on Earth, Osai invited him to dinner at a restaurant in Cape Town that overlooked the ocean. She ordered something called a lamb chop. She asked about his children. She recommended the dessert. She was, by every observable measure, completely unbothered by his presence. That was when Vral understood, with a cold certainty he could not yet prove, that he had been shown exactly what humanity wanted him to see. Not through deception, not through falsified records or holograms or any of the methods he was trained to detect. Simply through the oldest intelligence technique in existence, letting you look where you wanted, so you never thought to look somewhere else. He filed his report on the flight home, inconclusive, no violations detected. He did not sleep for the entire journey. 3 months later, the Drathari annexed the human colony on Kepler 7d. And Vral, watching the conclave emergency session from his office, found himself thinking not about the Drathari fleet that had moved into position with terrifying efficiency, but about the way Amara Osai had looked at him across that dinner table. Calm, patient, like a woman who had already calculated every move in a game that everyone else hadn't realized had already begun. He thought about 11 times the fuel cells. He thought about all that titanium. He poured himself a drink he didn't finish, and he waited, with a dread he could not entirely explain, to see what humanity would do next. Captain Siva of the Yulani free merchant vessel Endless Prophet had a rule she lived by professionally and personally. Never fly near human-marked space without checking your instruments twice and your courage once. It wasn't that humans were hostile to traders. Quite the opposite. Human ports were among the most efficient in the conclave. Their customs officers were fair, their tariffs negotiable, and they had a baffling cultural obsession with giving you food whenever you visited, regardless of whether you had a digestive system compatible with their cuisine. She had once been handed something called a samosa at the Titan Station docking office, and had politely eaten it while internally calculating whether it would cause organ failure. It had not. It had been, in fact, remarkable. No, the reason she avoided human-marked space, specifically the outer corridors beyond Jupiter, was simpler. Her instruments always behaved strangely out there. Sensor ghosts, gravitational microanomalies. Her navigation AI would occasionally flag objects of impossible mass that disappeared the moment she ran a secondary scan. She had complained about it once at a conclave traders forum and been told, by a human rep, that the area was a navigational hazard zone due to residual gas giant interference. She had accepted this explanation the way experienced merchants accept explanations that don't quite add up, with a smile, a nod, and a mental note never to bring it up again. Which made it particularly unfortunate that, 6 months before the Drathari crisis ignited, a catastrophic coolant failure sent the Endless Prophet drifting off her registered course and directly into the outer Sol corridor at 3 in the morning, ship time, while Siva was asleep. She was woken by her first mate, a young Yulani named Preth, who was whispering. She would always remember that detail. He was whispering, the way people whisper when they are near something sleeping and do not want to wake it. "Captain," he said, "you need to see this." The bridge was completely silent. Her 6-person crew stood at their stations, none of them moving, all of them staring at the forward view screen. The coolant failure had been repaired, autopilot had handled it, but they were still off course. Jupiter was behind them. Ahead was what should have been empty space, a known stretch of navigational dead zone with nothing on record for 40 million kilometers. Except the passive optical sensors, which even human spoofing technology struggled to fully mask, were showing them something. At first Siva thought it was a moon. The sheer mass of it registered like a geological body. It had gravitational pull. Her ship had already micro-adjusted twice without her noticing, the autopilot quietly correcting for an object that wasn't supposed to be there. Then she looked at the shape. Moons are round. The laws of physics, across every star system the conclave had charted, enforced this without exception. Sufficient mass becomes a sphere. This was not a sphere. It was angular, geometric. It had lines, deliberate, engineered lines running along its body in faint bioluminescent patterns that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. It was dark, so dark it seemed to swallow the starlight around it, like someone had cut a hole in space and forgotten to fill it. And it was enormous, not station enormous, not even the conclave's vast station enormous. This was something else entirely. "How long have we been in range?" Siva asked. Preth checked, "About 4 minutes." "Have they hailed us?" "No." "Scanned us?" He hesitated. 17 times, active scans, military grade. They know exactly who we are and what we're carrying. And yet nothing had happened. No challenge, no warning, no weapons lock, or at least no weapons lock they had detected. Siva had the sudden, absolute conviction that she was being allowed to look, that something impossibly large and impossibly patient was watching her the way a mountain watches a mouse, not with malice, but with the total indifference of something that has never had reason to hurry. "Get us out of here," she said quietly. "Don't accelerate hard, don't run, just correct course," calmly. They did, nothing followed them. She filed the report. She included the sensor logs, the gravitational data, the optical footage, grainy and distant but undeniable. The Conclave Shipping Guild reviewed it, consulted with a human technical liaison who explained that large gas giant moons sometimes cast unusual gravitational signatures, and officially logged SCI-F's report as sensor malfunction due to coolant failure interference. SCI-F was a merchant, not a politician. She took her ship, her crew, and her extremely uncomfortable feeling, and she quietly rerouted every future contract away from anything within 30 light minutes of the Sol system. But she kept a copy of that footage, encrypted, hidden in a partition her own crew didn't know about. She watched it sometimes, late at night, when the stars outside her viewport looked a little too peaceful. Whatever that thing was, it had not moved. It had not threatened her. It had simply existed, with the absolute confidence of something that had never needed to prove it was dangerous because the universe had not yet been foolish enough to make it necessary. 41 weeks later, when the news broke across every conclave channel simultaneously, she pulled out the footage and watched it one final time. Then she poured herself a drink, thought about the samosa, and decided that humans were the most terrifying species she had ever had the privilege of trading with. The Drathari had a saying, ancient and proud, passed down through warrior lineages stretching back 4,000 years. Power undemonstrated is power that does not exist. They lived by it. They had built an empire on it. Every border expansion, every tributary species, every system quietly absorbed into the Drathari hegemony had followed the same elegant formula. Demonstrate overwhelming power early, and the cost of actual war becomes theoretical. Most species, when shown the mathematics clearly enough, made the rational choice. The humans had been shown the mathematics at Kepler 7d. 3 battle groups, 47 ships, the colony's orbital defense platform, a single aging frigate and 2 automated gun stations, was neutralized in 11 minutes. The 70,000 human colonists were given 6 hours to evacuate with personal belongings only. The freighters attempting to run the blockade, 3 of them, civilian vessels, unarmed, were destroyed when they refused to heave to. 22 humans died, civilians, in escape pods that a Drathari gunship captain had apparently decided were potential threats. Ambassador Gretvaz delivered the Drathari position to the conclave emergency session with the practiced ease of someone reading a weather report. Kepler 7d had been historically claimed under the pre-conclave Drathari expansion maps of 3200. Humanity's subsequent colonization had occurred in disputed space. The hegemony was simply clarifying borders. Reparations could be discussed, over time, through proper channels, at a pace the Drathari found convenient. He expected outrage from the small species. He expected concern from the mid-tier powers. He expected the Yulani to request a trade exemption from any resulting sanctions. He expected the Keth to file a formal protest that would be thoroughly ignored. He expected from humanity their standard response, measured diplomatic condemnation, a formal conclave resolution that would take 6 months to draft and another year to implement, and the quiet, dignified suffering of a species that was simply not powerful enough to do anything else. He did not expect Amara Osai to walk to the podium and stand there for a moment in complete silence, looking not at the ambassador, but at the full chamber, all 214 conclave representatives, with an expression that could only be described as someone who had been waiting a very long time for a moment they had always known was coming. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly level. The Drathari hegemony will withdraw all military assets from Kepler 7d, return all confiscated colonist property, and submit to a full conclave tribunal for the unlawful destruction of civilian vessels. This will occur within 72 hours. She paused. We will not ask again. The chamber erupted, not in concern, in laughter or the various alien equivalents of it. The Sorvek delegation made a sound like grinding glass that their translators rendered as amusement. The Belvari representative leaned to his aide and said something that the open mic system caught. Do humans not know how many ships the Drathari have? Ambassador Gretvaz allowed himself a slow smile, the Drathari version all teeth. Director General Osai, he said, his translator carrying just the right amount of condescension. The hegemony appreciates humanity's passion. However, passion and capability are different instruments. He gestured broadly at the chamber. The conclave has processes. We are committed to those processes. Osai looked at him. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't produce counter-evidence or make a counteroffer or request a mediator. She simply looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, nodded once as if confirming something privately to herself, and walked back to her seat. The session was adjourned. The Drathari did not move from Kepler 7D. The conclave's emergency committee began scheduling its first formal review session for 11 days' time. The 72-hour clock was ticking. The galaxy watched, most of it the way people watch someone about to trip, with the uncomfortable mixture of pity and inevitability. Vral watched differently. He had requested emergency security access to deep-range sensor feeds covering the Sol system under the pretense of routine Accord monitoring. He sat in his office and watched those feeds and counted down the hours with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite awe, but lived in the exact uncomfortable space between them. He had seen what was out there. He had simply been allowed to leave. Hour 68, hour 70, hour 71. At hour 72 and 4 minutes, a transmission went out from Earth, not to the Drathari, not to the Conclave Emergency Committee. To everyone, simultaneously, every ship, every station, every telescope array on every inhabited world in conclave space. A set of coordinates, a timestamp, and a message in 214 languages, all saying the same thing. Look at the edge of the Sol system. Now, there are moments in history that do not announce themselves as history. They arrive quietly, dressed as ordinary events, and only later, when the trembling stops and the mind can form coherent sentences again, does the weight of what was witnessed become real. This was not one of those moments. This one announced itself completely. The USCS Aegis Eternal dropped out of stealth at 900 Earth Standard Time on a Wednesday, humans again, inexplicably attached to the idea that the day of the week mattered at the outer edge of the Sol system, just beyond the heliopause, where interstellar space begins and the sun becomes just another star. Every telescope in the conclave was already pointed at those coordinates. Every sensor array that could reach that far was already active. Vral had been awake for 31 hours. Captain Siva was on her bridge with a cold drink she had forgotten to consume. Ambassador Gretvaz was in his quarters on Station Voss, having been woken by an aide who had simply said, "Sir, you need to come to the observation deck," in a voice that made him move without asking why. The Aegis Eternal did not appear dramatically. It did not flash into existence with fire and light. It simply became visible, as if a portion of space had decided to stop pretending, the way a held breath is released. One moment there was nothing. The next, there was everything. At 41 kilometers in length, it defied the brain's initial attempt at scale. The first instinct, looking at the sensor imagery, was that the data was wrong, that some decimal point had been misplaced, some unit of measurement confused. Ships were not 41 kilometers long. Nothing built by hands, any species' hands, was 41 kilometers long. The Voss Accord's largest permitted warship class was 1.2 kilometers. The Aegis Eternal was longer than some moons. Its cross-section was wider than most space stations. Its hull, layered in what human technical documentation would later call adaptive void iron composite plating, a material whose alloy composition would take conclave scientists 4 years to partially reverse engineer, absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making it appear as a massive geometric shadow against the stars, defined not by what you could see, but by what wasn't there. Along its spine, visible even at distance, ran 24 raised structures that every military analyst in the conclave identified within seconds for what they were: mass accelerator spinal cannons. Each one, later calculated, capable of launching a tungsten composite slug at 0.4% the speed of light. At that velocity, the kinetic energy released on impact was measured not in megatons but in planetary impact equivalents. Its hangar bays, there were 6 of them, each the size of a major conclave naval base, were closed, but the energy signatures leaking from them were enough. Vraal's instruments identified at minimum 47 subvessels docked internally: destroyers, carriers, strike craft, enough firepower nested inside this single ship like weapons inside a weapon to constitute a mid-tier conclave member nation's entire active fleet. 3 gravitational signatures emanated from its core. Vraal stared at the reading for a long time before his brain processed what it meant. 3 compressed singularity cores, not fusion drives, not antimatter reactors. Compressed singularities. Humanity had built a ship and powered it with 3 miniaturized black holes kept stable through technology the Conclave had classified as theoretically achievable within the next 2 centuries. Nobody spoke on the observation deck of Station Voss for a very long time. Gret Voss stood at the viewport, the great Drathari ambassador, voice of the most feared military empire in the Conclave, a being who had stood in front of 6 different Conclave emergency sessions and smiled at the measured outrage of weaker species, stood there and said nothing. His aide tried to speak once and stopped. The grinding glass amusement sound the Sorvak delegation made had a different quality now. Lower, slower. In the conclave chamber, the emergency committee session dissolved without adjournment. Representatives simply stopped speaking mid-sentence and reached for communication devices. Siva set down her drink very carefully. An OSI's transmission arrived, calm, professional, formatted in standard conclave diplomatic protocol, as if she were filing a routine shipping variance. The United Systems colonial ship Aegis Eternal is conducting scheduled deep space calibration trials in international space, in full compliance with the Voss Accord's jurisdictional boundaries. We wish to remind the Drathari hegemony that the withdrawal deadline for Kepler 7d has passed. We are available to discuss next steps at any time. Have a good morning. The Aegis Eternal did not move. It did not fire. It did not broadcast threats or demands or declarations of war. It simply existed at the edge of humanity's solar system in the cold dark between stars and let the galaxy do the mathematics. It took the galaxy approximately 4 minutes. Admiral Yusra Khalid Torres had commanded the Aegis Eternal for 11 years. She had commanded it while it was still being built, supervising the final installation of the Singularity cores in year 7, sleeping 3 decks above the main spinal cannon array in a bunk that vibrated faintly when the power systems ran their nightly calibration cycles. She had grown so accustomed to the vibration that she couldn't sleep without it anymore. She was 53 years old. She had been born on a deep space mining platform in the asteroid belt. She had never lived on Earth for more than 6 consecutive months in her entire life. Space was not, for her, a frontier. It was simply home. She stood now on the bridge of the Aegis Eternal, a space so large that it required its own internal transit system to cross efficiently, and watched the sensor feeds showing her the conclave's response. The cascading communications traffic, the suddenly rerouted Drathari naval signals, the very specific silence coming from Station Voss, which was louder than any transmission she'd received in years. Her XO, Commander Davi Akafer, stood at the secondary display and read quietly aloud from the intercepted conclave communications. Shock, confusion, fear, a great deal of fear, in every language the translator could render. "We're trending on every conclave newsfeed simultaneously," he said. "The Drathari Defense Ministry just called an emergency session." A pause. "The Yulani Stock Exchange has halted trading." Khalid Torres said nothing for a moment. She was looking at a photo she kept on the edge of her command console, framed in plain steel. It was old, printed on actual paper, which she'd had laminated. 3 people standing in front of a ship under construction, the frame of something enormous visible behind them in the dim light of a construction dock. Her grandmother, her grandmother's commanding officer. And in the background, barely visible, the first curved section of the Aegis Eternal's bow, before anyone outside a classified clearance level knew what it was going to become. Her grandmother had started this, not the design that had been a collaborative effort spanning 30 years and 6 engineering generations, but the decision. The moment 30 years ago when a small group of human military and government leaders had sat down with the historical record of every war humanity had ever lost, every planet they'd conceded, every treaty signed under duress, every time they'd been told to be patient, be reasonable, be measured, and had said quietly to each other, "Never again." "They think we built this because we're aggressive," HFY said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I know," she said. "Are we going to correct that impression?" She thought about her grandmother, about the mining platform she'd grown up on, which had been boarded by Drathari customs officials, when she was 9 years old and had only been released after her mother paid a levy that took 3 years to recover from. About the Mevari, that gentle, brilliant species she had studied in school, now extinct, because they had trusted the Conclave's protection and the Conclave had been too slow. "Not today," she said. Because the truth was complicated. The Aegis Eternal wasn't born from hatred. It was born from memory. Humans remembered everything, every slight, every loss, every lesson. They were, as a species, constitutionally incapable of forgetting what happened to those who were too weak to protect themselves. And so they had done what humans have always done when faced with a problem significant enough to demand it. They had dedicated themselves to solving it, with complete focus, across generations, until the solution was so thorough it couldn't be argued with. The ship wasn't a weapon of conquest. It was a locked door, a statement made in steel and physics and 40 years of quiet, patient, unflinching work. "You will not make us helpless again." She thought about the 22 civilians who had died in Kepler 7D escape pods. She thought about their names, which she had memorized. She let herself feel the weight of that not as anger, but as the specific, heavy grief of someone who has built a machine for exactly this moment and understands completely why it was necessary. "Open a channel to the crew," she said. On a ship 41 kilometers long with a complement of 14,000 personnel, the all-hands chime was a sound like a deep bell, felt more than heard. "This is the Admiral," she said. "You don't need a speech from me. You know what this ship is and you know why we built it. Today that work speaks for itself." She paused. "Stand easy, maintain all stations, and get some rest. We're going to be here a while." She closed the channel, looked out at the stars. "Somewhere behind her," HFY said softly, "Drathari Defense Ministry just authorized a withdrawal order for Kepler 7D. She nodded, didn't smile. This was not a moment for smiling. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold hours ago, and drank it anyway. A thing her grandmother used to do, the emergency session of the Drathari Defense Conclave, a body that had not convened at maximum membership since the 7th Border War 4 centuries ago, lasted 19 hours. It was held in the deep mountain fortress of Vrethkal on the Drathari homeworld, in a chamber lined with the trophy weapons of 1,000 conquered enemies, where the stone itself was stained with the ceremonial war pigments of generations of Drathari generals. It was not, for the first time in living memory, a comfortable room. Fleet Admiral Zorathken presented the tactical analysis first. He was thorough, clinical, and had the professional honesty of a military officer who understood that self-deception before a battle is a faster path to defeat than any enemy weapon. He displayed the Aegis Eternal's known specifications on the main projection. He displayed the Drathari fleet's response capabilities. He ran 17 different combat simulations, varying fleet positioning, attack vectors, alpha strike scenarios, everything the hegemony's finest tactical minds had been running on loop for the past 6 hours. The average time before Drathari fleet combat effectiveness was reduced to below 30% in each simulation, 4 hours and 11 minutes. In 11 of the 17 simulations, the Drathari homeworld was within theoretical strike range before any counteroffensive reached the Sol system. He did not editorialize. He presented the numbers and stepped back. What followed was 3 hours of argument from the faction that did not want to believe the numbers. These were not cowards. The Drathari did not produce cowards, culturally speaking. These were warriors, some decorated over decades of genuine conflict, who operated from the deep genetic assumption that will, aggression, and the honor of battle could compensate for tactical disadvantage. They argued that the humans would not truly fire, that it was theater, that no species actually built a weapon of this scale with the intention of using it, that it was deterrence, and deterrence could be called as a bluff. War Marshal Tethak, the oldest officer in the room and the only one present who had personally fought in 2 separate border wars, had not spoken for the first 3 hours. He sat at the far end of the table, eyes half closed, in the posture his subordinates recognized as the one he wore when he was waiting for lesser minds to exhaust themselves. When the bluff faction fell silent, he spoke. "I want to ask the room one question," he said. His voice was low. "In the 80 years since humanity joined the Conclave, 80 years of observing this species, trading with them, negotiating with them, sharing treaty space with them, has any human representative ever made a threat they did not fulfill?" Silence. "Has any human commander ever issued an ultimatum that was a bluff?" More silence. "Has any human government, in any documented encounter we have on record, said, 'We will not ask again,' and then asked again?" The silence was now a different quality, heavier. "The question before this chamber is not whether the Aegis Eternal can do what we calculate it can do," Tethak said. "The question is whether humans are the kind of species that builds a thing like that and then leaves it unfired when their conditions are not met." He looked at each face in the room slowly. "I submit that the historical record answers this question clearly, and that continuing to debate it is a form of comfort we cannot afford." He stood. "We withdraw from Kepler 7D. We compensate the families of the 22 dead. We submit to the tribunal." He straightened his uniform. "And then we begin building." The vote was not close. Gretvaz filed the withdrawal notification through official conclave channels within the hour. Formal. Correct. He included a statement calling it a good faith gesture toward renewed dialogue, the diplomatic equivalent of saying you tripped when everyone watched you fall. No one was fooled and no one commented. By the end of that same day, Drathari military engineers received their new classified directive. Begin preliminary design work on a tonnage unlimited deep space combat platform. Estimated development timeline, 40 years. A junior engineer in the hegemony's shipyard division asked his supervisor privately, "Why 40 years?" "Because that's how long it takes," his supervisor said. "If you're doing it right." And unlike the humans, he paused, looking at something that might have been respect and might have been the edge of something much more sobering. "We're only starting now." Formal VAS Accord violation investigation was launched with the kind of institutional energy that organizations generate when they need to appear decisive while being entirely uncertain what to do. Every conclave member with legal standing filed a request to join the investigative panel. The hearing chamber at Station VAS was at capacity for the first time in 80 years. Assessor Vral chaired it. He had asked for the assignment. His supervisor had tried to dissuade him, suggesting that someone more senior might be appropriate for a matter of this visibility. And Vral had explained, politely but with a precision that ended the conversation, that he had been trying to find this for 2 years and he would be damned. Using the human expression he had inexplicably adopted, if he was going to hand it off now. He called Amara Ose as the first and only witness the human side offered. She arrived without legal counsel, without aides, without the stack of defensive documentation that every other species under investigation had historically brought. She arrived with a single data tablet, a glass of water, and the same expression she had worn when she had told the Drathari ambassador 72 hours and delivered exactly what she had promised. Vral opened with the core charge. The Aegis Eternal represented a clear violation of the VAS Accord's tonnage limits for registered military vessels. Osai took a sip of water. "Assessor Vral," she said, "what is the legal definition of a military vessel under the VAS Accord?" He quoted it from memory. He had written most of it. Any constructed space-going platform designed, armed, and crewed primarily for offensive or defensive military engagement, registered as such under the member species' naval classification system. She nodded. "Could you tell me how the Aegis Eternal is registered under United Systems maritime law?" He already knew the answer, had known it for 2 days, since their legal team first cracked the relevant document archive. He had spent those 2 days in a complicated relationship with his own feelings about it. "As a," he said slowly, precisely, "multi-purpose deep space exploration and colonial protection platform." "That's correct," Osai said pleasantly. "Registered 15 years ago, inspected by our own regulatory bodies annually. No conclave inspection was ever requested of this vessel class because it is not, under the Accord's definition, a military vessel." The chamber noise rose significantly. "It has 24 mass accelerator spinal cannons," said the Belvari representative, breaking protocol to speak out of turn. "It has an extensive scientific survey array," Osei agreed, "alongside a robust self-defense capability. Many deep exploration vessels carry armaments. The Accord does not restrict armaments on non-military classified platforms." "It carries an internal fleet," said the Sorvak representative, making the grinding sound at a register that the translators marked as barely controlled disbelief. "It has very large hangar facilities," Osei said, "for support craft, scientific landers, rescue vessels, long-range scouts." The chamber was in complete uproar. Vral let it run for exactly 90 seconds, then called it to order. He looked at Osai for a long moment. She looked back. There was no smugness in her expression, no triumphalism, just that quality he had first noticed over dinner in Cape Town: patience. The patient look of someone who had seen this moment clearly years ago and had simply been waiting for the calendar to catch up. "Director General," he said quietly, and off the record, he let a fraction of his genuine feeling enter his voice. "You understand that what you have done is not, technically, an Accord violation, but it has destroyed the Accord in every practical sense." "Has it?" she said. "Or has it revealed that the Accord only ever functioned because the species it most constrained chose to honor it? We honored it. We built nothing we registered as a military vessel beyond permitted limits." She set down her water glass precisely. "The Accord restricted those who followed it and protected those who were willing to push its edges. We did not push its edges. We read its exact language and built accordingly." She paused. "If the Accord is broken, Assessor, I'd look carefully at who else has been reading it loosely and benefiting from that looseness for the past 6 centuries. The conclave fractured in the weeks that followed, not into war, but into something more complex and ultimately more permanent, competing blocks of self-interest. The Drathari, humiliated and recalculating. The Yulani, quietly delighted that the dominant military power had been neutralized and already dispatching trade envoys to Earth. The smaller species, a dozen of them, whose embassies began requesting private meetings with the human mission within 48 hours of the hearing's conclusion. Not to protest, to ask for appointments. 1 year later, Station Voss had changed in ways that weren't visible on any official record but were completely legible to anyone paying attention. The Drathari delegation's table, always positioned at the center right of the chamber, the subtle geography of power had been moved. Not by mandate. They had simply chosen a less prominent location, and no one had commented, and somehow that was worse. The human mission had expanded. 3 new wings, 12 additional staff, a formal diplomatic reception hall that was, by all accounts, always fully booked. Vral visited Earth for the second time in his life on a Thursday morning, the humans still nomming their days, still inexplicably attached to it, and was once again met at the Cape Town orbital elevator. Not by Osai, by an aide who said the Director General was ready for him in her office and asked if he'd eaten. He said he hadn't. He was given a samosa. The office was on the 41st floor of the Earth Diplomatic Center, with a view of the ocean that seemed designed specifically to make you feel small in the most pleasant possible way. Osai was reviewing documents when he entered. She stood, shook his hand, the human gesture he still found slightly startling in its physical directness, and gestured him to a chair. He set down his formal documentation without preamble, a mutual defense arrangement request, on behalf of the Keth Directorate. Osai read it in full. Vral had expected questions, negotiations, a counter-proposal. She picked up a pen, an actual pen, because she was the kind of person who used actual pens, and signed the authorization cover page. "We'll have the full agreement drafted within 10 days, she said. "Our terms are standard. Keth maintains full sovereignty, no human military presence without invitation, joint defensive response triggers." She set down the pen. "Is there anything you want me to know before we proceed?" He had prepared remarks. Professional, careful remarks about Keth's strategic interests and border vulnerability relative to Drathari vassal states. He had written them on the flight over. Instead, he said, "I owe you an apology." She waited. "When I came to inspect your facilities 2 years ago, I was looking for evidence of deception. I thought we all thought that you were hiding something you should not have been building, something that violated the spirit of the Accord." He paused. "I found nothing because what you built doesn't exist in the categories we thought to look in. But I have spent a year thinking about something you said at the hearing, about building exactly what the language permitted." He looked at her. "I am not sure whether to call what you did a technicality or a philosophy." "Both," she said simply. "Why?" he asked. "Why not simply build what you needed and withdraw from the Accord? You had the capability, long before any of this happened. Why the precision? Why the exact language?" Osai was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Cape Town ocean moved the way oceans do, with total indifference to the things happening on the shore. "Because we wanted it to matter," she said. "When we moved, we wanted it to be unambiguous. Not humanity broke the rules and got away with it. But humanity followed the rules exactly as written, and the rules turned out to say something different than everyone assumed." She paused. "We didn't want to win by cheating. We wanted to win by being right." Vral sat with that for a moment. "I have one question," he said. "Before I came, what did you think you would find?" She smiled just slightly. "I thought you'd be good at your job and find nothing, because we had been very careful. And if I had found something, we would have dealt with it," she said, in a tone that closed the subject with perfect, gentle finality. He asked, "How many more are there? Ships like the Aegis Eternal?" She looked at him pleasantly and did not answer. Which was, he understood the answer. On the flight home, he looked out the viewport at the stars and thought about the last year. The conclave reshaped. New alliances forming. A dozen small civilizations that had spent centuries navigating carefully between larger powers now standing slightly straighter, speaking slightly more firmly in conclave sessions. The Drathari Empire still vast, still powerful, but conducting itself with a new and very specific quality of caution. And somewhere at the edge of the Sol system, in the dark beyond Jupiter, in the cold between stars, something immense and patient and quiet, running on the heartbeat of 3 compressed singularities, keeping its eternal watch. It had fired no weapons. It had made no demands. It had simply appeared at the moment it was needed and changed everything by existing. Vral thought about what Os had said at dinner the first time he'd visited. Kindness. He had thought at the time that it was a strange word for what humans had done, building in secret, hiding power, waiting decades. He understood it now. They had hidden the Aegis Eternal not to ambush anyone, not to strike from the dark, but because a galaxy that knew it existed would have been a frightened galaxy, and frightened civilizations do irrational, violent things. Humans had waited until the precise moment when showing it was the only thing that would prevent violence rather than cause it. They had kept the secret as long as they could. Out of kindness. He thought about the Mevari, those gentle, brilliant people who were gone now, who had trusted the system to protect them. He thought about what it would have meant for them, a century ago, if a ship like the Aegis Eternal had existed and been seen and been known. He thought maybe, just maybe, the galaxy was finally learning the right lesson. Not the lesson of fear, the lesson of what comes after fear. The USCS Aegis Eternal held its quiet patrol at the edge of everything humanity had ever called home, visible now on every telescope, listed in every conclave database, cataloged, studied, discussed in 1,000 strategic sessions and academic papers and late-night conversations between species that were reconsidering things they thought they had understood. It did not move, it did not threaten, it did not need to. It was simply there, as it had always been, as it would remain. Patient, enormous, waiting. A locked door, a memory made of steel, a message written in the language of physics addressed to the entire galaxy that said only this: we were always here. We were always ready. We simply chose, out of kindness, to wait.